Good day. As the leaders of the Western powers continue with their various meetings in Germany and Spain, in Madrid, the war in Ukraine continues to grind on in what I still maintain, in fact I insist, is one clear direction. Now, yesterday in my previous video, I said that there were reports that the Russians and their allies from the Donbass militia were in control of the city, the town of Lysychansk, the one remaining part of Lugansk region which is still under Ukrainian control. Now, over the last couple of hours, what we've learned is that the Russians, instead of advancing within Lysychansk itself, have continued their efforts to tighten the ring around the Ukrainian forces in Lysychansk. So parts of Lysychansk, at least, appear to be under Russian control. The Russians appear to be in the process of capturing the important Lysychansk oil refinery. I said important in terms of the defense of the city. But perhaps more importantly, over the last couple of hours, they've launched a counteroffensive, a further offensive towards Lysychansk from the north. They've crossed the Seversky Donets River, and they seem to be moving steadily towards tightening further the ring around the Ukrainian troops in Lysychansk. Now, I should say that the crossing of the Seversky Donets River by the Russians has taken place in the same wooded area where some weeks ago the Russians previously attempted to cross the Seversky Donets River and were struck by Ukrainian artillery, presumably from Lysychansk, and suffered heavy losses. And we also saw those pictures and videos of the damage done. Though, as I've said on many occasions, there are unanswered questions about those photographs and videos, which I'm not going to discuss here. There's no doubt at all that the Russians did try to cross the Seversky Donets River, and it proved a failure. And I'm going to say, can be a bit mischievous here, and perhaps I don't want to push this point, but a few days ago, there was a particular suggestion made that the Ukrainian forces in Lysychansk escape from the city with their heavy equipment by themselves crossing the Seversky Donetsk River in essentially the same area and using a road through the forest to escape encirclement by the Russians. Well, I was skeptical that the Ukrainians would be able to do that. And in fact, and in practice, and perhaps unsurprisingly, in this particular area, it's the Russians who've done it instead. The idea of the Ukrainians carrying out a night crossing of the Seversky Donets River into territory controlled by the Russians whilst trying to flee from Lysychansk seemed to me improbable. Now, of course, the Russians, who are very much on the offensive in this territory, have basically killed that option, if it ever existed, by crossing the Seversky Donets River themselves. And the point about this is that it tightens the ring around Lysychansk. Shortly before I did this program, I saw a tweet by a blogger, a journalist sympathetic to the Ukrainian side, who now says that the corridor through which Ukrainian troops in Lysychansk would have to pass in order to escape from Lysychansk is now only 13 kilometers wide. In other words, it is easily crossed, it is easily covered by Russian artillery. It's not completely closed, but presumably it will be before very long. And within the next couple of days, this cauldron will have slammed shut, and the Ukrainian forces in Lysychansk, I'm not going to even try to guess how many of them there are now, will be trapped. And of course, if the earlier reports about the Russians controlling a third of the city are to be believed, They are only anyway in control of part of it. So a desperate situation for the Ukrainian troops in Lysychansk. Now, I would make one quick observation, and this Russian move, sending troops across the Seversky Donets River to tighten the encirclement of Lysychansk, again highlights a point I've been making about Russian tactics and strategy throughout this war, right from the start, even whilst the Russians were camped outside Kiev. I was saying always that the primary Russian focus, the main battle, would be in Donbass. And I was also saying that the primary objective of the Russians was to destroy the Ukrainian army in the Donbass, which consists of the best trained, most battle-hardened, best equipped troops that Ukraine has. And we've seen how this has now been working its way out over the last couple of weeks. And this battle in Lysychansk is another example of what the Russians are doing. Because, of course, in theory, they could leave a corridor, an escape corridor for the Ukrainians in Lysychansk to pull out. And that might make it actually easier for the Russians to take Lysychansk. But the Russian objective isn't just to take Lysychansk. It is to destroy the best troops Ukraine has, the ones who were present at the start of the war in Donbass. And a significant proportion of these, a significant number of these, I'm not going to guess what large a proportion or what large a number, but a significant part of these is now holed up in Lysychansk. So what the Russians want to do is they want to capture Lysychansk, but they also want to force this contingent, this Ukrainian force in Lysychansk to surrender, or if not surrender, to face destruction. And in practice, most of them, of course, will surrender. Now, that achieves the twin objective, obviously, of capturing Lysychansk, which is another step in the clearing of the Donbass, but it also fulfills the larger objective, which is to destroy the Ukrainian army in Donbass. And as I've repeatedly said, the objective, the Russian objective, is the destruction of Ukraine's army, at least if it's the better part of that army, destroying with it Ukraine's ability to sustain the war, to continue the war, thereby breaking Ukraine's will to continue fighting, and on that basis to achieve peace, a peace which the Russians are now making it clear will only happen if Ukraine submits to Russian demands, which in effect means accepts a Russian victory. And on this point, by the way, President Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov could not be more clear. A couple of days ago, President Zelensky of Ukraine addressed the G7 leaders during their meeting in the castle in Germany, in southern Germany. And he told the Western leaders that the G7 needed to find some way of bringing the war to an end before the winter. And of course, he didn't quite say why, but I've thrown out some possibilities that Ukraine is now worried that if this war drags on for much longer, most of its army will be destroyed. Its economy is already in chaos and steadily falling apart. And realistically, Ukraine may struggle to get through the winter in any coherent form. And Zelensky also may be having legitimate worries about whether Western support for Ukraine will continue as the bitter winter months close in Europe and in the West in general. So, in response to those comments about from Zelensky about the need to end the war before the winter, Peskov, Putin's spokesman, said that actually the war could end tomorrow, all the Ukrainians need to do is to lay down their arms, in other words, capitulate and accept in their entirety Russian conditions, Russian demands, which we don't fully know what they are, but which the Russians say they've communicated in writing to the Ukrainians. So, in other words, the Russians are saying, it's very simple now, the time for negotiation essentially has passed. The thing Ukraine must do is surrender. So, I'm not sure how categorical this Russian position is. I'll come to that in a moment. But that's where we are, and that's the objective to which the Russians are steadily and incrementally moving. And of course, destroying Ukraine's army in Donbass is one way to achieve that objective. The encirclement of the Ukrainian forces in Lysychansk being part of that strategy, and at the same time, this relentless destruction of Ukraine's industrial infrastructure is another part of it. And here again, we're always hearing about how Russians are about, Russia's about to run out of missiles. Well, if anything, it seems to me that over the last couple of days, the volume of Russian missile attacks across Ukraine has, if anything, increased. The pace has increased, and we've seen all these attacks on places like, in Kremenchuk, the one which supposedly hit the department store. There's some reports now, there's some reason to believe, including from some Western journalists on the spot, that in fact the missile actually did not strike at and was not targeted at this store. It actually hit a neighbouring industrial building near the railway, near some railway tracks, which was being used to store and refurbish military equipment, and that the explosions caused a fire which spread to the department store, which again, there are some suggestions, some reports that the store at the time was empty. Well, I'm not present on the scene. I'm not going to get into a detailed discussion as to whether or not that is true. President Zelensky continues to insist that this was a deliberate attack on a department store which was open and active and in which people were presumably trading. But anyway, I'm not going to get into that. Either way, thankfully, the number of people killed, though high by most standards, does not seem to be to the level of the 1,000 of people that President Zelensky says were present in this store at the time when the missile itself attacked. And by the way, on that topic, the missile in question was a Russian Kh-22, very large missile, launched, by the way, by Tupolev 22M3 bombers. And the one thing I've heard people say is that if a department store had really been struck by a missile of that size, then the devastation would have been incalculable. And if there really had been 1,000 people there, well, many more would have died. Anyway, I'm not, as I said, an expert on these things. I'm not there on the ground. I mention these points. The Ukrainians say one thing, the Russians say another. Some independent journalists, including some pro-Ukrainian journalists on the spot, seem to be leaning at the moment towards the Russian version. But I'm not going to come down one way or the other and say which account is true. Both sides have been economical with the truth over the course of this war. Anyway, there we are. So, destruction of Ukraine's army in Donbass, destruction of Ukraine's industrial economy through all of these missile strikes. And of course, these missile strikes are not just targeting Ukraine's military industrial system. They're also, which is also, of course, part of its civilian economy and which form an important part of Ukraine's GDP. These factories don't just produce military goods, but the Russians also carry out multiple strikes on other military targets, on missile bases, on radar stations, on training camps, on barracks. All that goes on all the time, every day, day after day. The effect, the cumulative effect on Ukraine must be massive. And on that topic, I should say that, well, lots of people go on about the effect, the sanctions on the Russian economy, which I will come to in a moment. The effect of these missile strikes on the Ukrainian economy is undeniable. Its GDP is collapsing, and the situation is going to get worse. And of course, if winter closes in, it potentially could get much worse. So that's, I think, where we are overall on the battlefields. Now, I'm going to now turn to what the Western leaders have been doing. Now, the most eye-catching piece of news is that President Erdogan, after meeting with the Swedish and Finnish governments, leaders in the NATO meeting that's now underway in Madrid, unsurprisingly dropped his veto on Swedish and Finnish entry into NATO. Now, I've always been openly skeptical, in fact, straightforwardly cynical about President Erdogan's motives in raising this issue, the issue of the Kurds, of the support of the Kurds, of the Finns and the Swedes. And I've always thought that there was a good chance. In fact, I've always thought it was highly likely that Erdogan would eventually drop his veto in return for whatever sweetener he hopes to have got. My impression, by the way, is that he didn't get very much this time. I think he found that he was under a great deal of pressure from the Western powers to accede to Swedish and Finnish entry to NATO. And I think he probably also found, perhaps to his disappointment, that the Russians were not prepared to pay him any great price to maintain his veto. So I think, as a result, being, shall we say, a calculating man, he sized up the odds, looked at his own self-interests and those of his country, and took the decision, the unsurprising decision, to drop the veto. Now, that means that Finland and Sweden will join NATO. And the thing to say about this is that the Russian response to this decision has been very measured. And I think I would like to say a few things about this before I proceed with the rest of the programme. Because, of course, the reality is that Swedish and Finnish neutrality has been a dead letter to all intents and purposes for some time. Now, if we first of all go to the subject of Sweden, Sweden is the country, it's the bigger, richer, more important country. You have to go back here to the 1960s, a time when Sweden was led by its veteran Prime Minister Tage Erlander. Erlander was Prime Minister of Sweden from shortly after the end of the Second World War, right up until the end of the 1960s. He was Prime Minister continuously for 23 years, and he was a Social Democrat, and it was under Tage Erlander that the Swedish Social Democratic model achieved its full form. Sweden became this great paragon of social democracy, which many people mistakenly still think it is. But the thing to understand about Erlander is that Erlander was somebody who was very committed to Swedish neutrality, which undoubtedly he saw as a mechanism for maintaining Swedish independence. And in order to assert this independence, he built up the Swedish armed forces to an extraordinary degree. I can remember back in the 60s and 70s that Sweden was producing all these extraordinary weapons systems, Draken fighters and vegan fighters and fighter jets, extraordinarily industrial and technological effort for a relatively small country like Sweden. And it was building a turretless tank, which apparently didn't work terribly well, and a self-propelled gun, all extraordinarily elaborate and complex and expensive and rather high-tech looking, and apparently not very effective either. But anyway, that's another story. The point is, Erlander built up Sweden's armed forces to a very considerable extent, and by some measures, in the 1960s, Sweden was spending more on defense per capita than any other country, apart from the United States, the Soviet Union, and Israel. So, this was a major military build-up by Sweden. Now, the point is, who was this military build-up directed against? Did Erlander imagine that there would be an attack on Sweden from the United States and the Western powers? Well, hardly. I mean, that was never really something that anybody in Sweden at that time or since or before has ever taken seriously. Clearly, the enemy against whom this military build-up in Sweden was targeted was the Soviet Union. And on top of all of this, there was another factor, which is that Erlander, at the same time, and some members of his government and of the Swedish political establishment were in the 50s and 60s toying with the idea of Sweden acquiring nuclear weapons. Now, this did meet quite a lot of opposition within Sweden at that time. It was unpopular with the left of the Swedish Social Democrats. By the way, I should say that Erlander himself was on the right at that time of the Social Democratic Party. The policies he followed would be considered beyond radical by any social democrat or so-called social democrat today. But anyway, Erlander did toy with the idea of acquiring nuclear weapons, and so did several people in the Swedish establishment. But this met with intense opposition, and rather than put his political position at risk, Erlander did a deal, and he did a deal that if Sweden were ever attacked, a certain country would come to Sweden's rescue, and that country was the United States. And that agreement was reached in the 1960s, and it's been in existence ever since, even though it's never talked about very much. But essentially that means that from the mid-1960s, Swedish neutrality became something of a fiction, because by definition, if Sweden enters into some kind of military understanding with the United States, it decides that it's not going to go for nuclear weapons, it's going to retain these powerful conventional armed forces, and it's going to do this deal with the United States, then Sweden, to all intents and purposes, from the United States, from the 1960s, has been a NATO ally, so a Western ally. So I think that's an important point to understand, because there's much talk about Swedish neutrality, but it actually means a lot less in practice, and has meant a lot less in practice than it has appeared to mean in theory. Now, why do the Swedes worry about the Russians? Well, there's a very long history of antagonism between the two countries going back to the 18th century. And I'm not going to go into great details about this. But I would say that one of the key events in Russian-Swedish history is the so-called Great Northern War that was fought between the Russia of Peter the Great and Sweden, and which resulted in Russia's victory and the capture of territory upon which Peter the Great built his capital, the current Russian city of St. Petersburg. And Putin made some comments about all of this a few days ago. And I just want to touch on this because they've been widely misrepresented. I mean, Putin attended a exhibition about Peter the Great, and then he made some comments about him, and he discussed the Great Northern War, and he said that the Great Northern War was not a case of Russia taking from Sweden Swedish territory. It was a case of Russia recapturing territory that had previously been Russian, that had been inhabited by the Slavs, and that this was not unlike what Russia is currently doing in Ukraine. So, of course, this led to a whole flurry of headlines all over the Western media. Putin is a megalomaniac. He thinks he's the new incarnation of Peter the Great and all of those things. What Putin was actually doing in anticipation of Sweden joining NATO was reminding the Swedes that there has been this history between them and Russia, that there has been a succession of wars, and Sweden has lost every one. So he was basically, in a very coded way, telling the Swedes to be careful. By this point, the Russians, who have no faith in Erdogan's vetoes, had already taken the view that Sweden's entry into NATO was a done thing. But Putin did quietly remind the Swedes that if they think that by joining NATO, this is going to give them any opportunity to engage in further adventures in the Baltics, then they're up against Russia, and Russia has defeated them in the past and will defeat them again. So that was the real point of that comment by Putin. I just want to make one final point, which is about Sweden, which is about Tage Erlander's massive military build-up of the 50s and 60s. Obviously, it was also partly intended to provide jobs to Swedish workers. And I'm sure some people in the thread will make that point. So I would say that obviously, partly that was part of the rationale as well. But my main point, anyway, is that the overt motivation for that Swedish military build-up was to counter the Soviets, and that in the 1960s, Erlander entered into what is in effect a defense agreement with the United States. So Swedish neutrality since that time, as I said, has never really existed. Now, Finland is a completely different matter. And here perhaps I'm going to just say something else about Finnish history, because one of the reasons why the Swedes and the Russians don't get on is because, as I said, Sweden has been on the losing side of various wars against Russia. And one of them was a war that was fought during the Napoleonic era between the Russians and the Swedes, in which the Russians captured the former Swedish territory of Finland. And they carved out of this territory what they called the Grand Duchy of Finland, which is essentially the Finland that we know today. And it was never formally, by the way, attached to the Russian Empire, or at least it wasn't formally attached to the Russian Empire until the last days of that empire under Nicholas II. But the Tsar of Russia was the Grand Duke of Finland, and he ran the country through his officials, but also through some Finnish representatives throughout the 19th century, right up until Finland gained complete independence from the Russian Empire at the time of the First World War. So the loss of Finland is one of those factors that has created tensions between Russia and Sweden. And by the way, there's a significant Swedish minority in Finland which remains very anti-Russian to this day. But anyway, putting all that aside, Finland took a different trajectory. After it gained independence, it also became extremely hostile to the Soviet Union. In 1939, Finland and the Soviet Union fought a brief war, the Winter War, which resulted in an eventual Finnish defeat and significant territorial losses to the Soviet Union. Finland then allied itself during the Second World War with Germany. After the German attack on the Soviet Union, it participated in the siege of Leningrad, St. Petersburg, as it formerly was and is now again today. And Finland then in 1944 had the good sense to pull out of the war and to come to an agreement with the Soviets. And one of the conditions that the Soviets imposed upon Finland, in return for Finland remaining both independent and preserving its own social and economic system, the Soviets did never sought to make Finland a communist state after the Second World War. One of the provisions was that Finland would become neutral, and that was agreed in 1948 by a treaty between Finland and the Soviet Union in 1948. And in the years after the Second World War, Finland and the Soviet Union became very close. And this was the era of President Urho Kekkonen, who actually attended Stalin's funeral in 1953, who pursued a policy of good relations with the Soviet Union. And these very good relations between Finland and the Soviet Union were part of the reason why Finland was able to develop economically very rapidly after the Second World War, because it became a kind of bridge between the Western world, to which Finland was still a part, because it had a capitalist mixed economy, but it also had good relations with the Soviet Union because of this neutrality treaty. Now, that neutrality treaty was scrapped after the Soviet Union collapsed. It was one of those things that the Soviets, rather the Russians, in one of those extraordinary decisions that were made during the 1990s, agreed to give up. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, Finnish policies shifted. Finnish politicians became more assertive towards Russia, and Finland also gradually gravitated towards the Western camp. And a key figure here was a Finnish politician, Martti Ahtisaari, who came from the areas, who originates from the areas of Finland that were conquered by the Soviets in 1939, and who always retained some bitter feelings about this. And of course, he was one of the officials that was sent to Yugoslavia during the bombing war of 1999, when he essentially managed to persuade President Milosevic of Yugoslavia to capitulate to Western demands. So Finland, from the 1990s, has drifted steadily towards the Western camp, and of course has become increasingly integrated in it. And it's important to say that during the Cold War, neither Sweden nor Finland were part of the European Union. But, of course, for some time now, they both have been. And, of course, joining the European Union is, in effect, a passport to integration within the Euro-Atlantic system. So when the Russians say, as Dmitry Medvedev, the current deputy chair of the Russian Security Council and the former president of Russia, when the Russians say that Finland and Sweden joining NATO is not going to make any fundamental change to the strategic balance in the Baltic, because it doesn't change the underlying picture in the Baltic, well, Medvedev is in one sense saying the truth. Both Finland and Sweden are EU member states and Western allies, and have been so in all but name for a very long time now. Now, I have to say that a lot more has been said in these two summit meetings at the G7 and at the NATO summit in Madrid. But I would like to just, before I come back to NATO and the NATO issues and how they might affect the situation in the Baltic and in Scandinavia, briefly touch on what has happened to Janet Yellen's Russian oil price cap idea. Because just as I derided it in my previous videos, now all across mainstream media, including the Washington Post, the Financial Times, the Daily Telegraph, all sorts of other places, this idea has elicited ridicule. And it's not just elicited ridicule because of the impossibility of imposing a global price cap on a traded commodity produced by one country, which is to say oil produced by Russia, but because the actual summit communique, the G7 summit communique, is worded in such a way that it could be implied that the price cap is intended to apply to oil everywhere. Now that must everybody's oil, in other words, the oil produced by all oil producers. Now, if the oil price cap idea with respect to Russian oil is fanciful, to say the least, the idea of an oil price cap globally on oil produced everywhere is straightforwardly utopian. I mean, it is a globalist fantasy at a time when the globalist structures, which were never all-encompassing anyway, are disintegrating. So the summit basically endorsed this idea, passed it to a working party, and it's not impossible that we'll never hear of it again, though it's, I'm afraid, equally possible, in fact, it's arguably more possible that some bizarre variant of it will come into place, and we could see another layer of complexity introduced into the international trading system, which is already becoming impossibly complicated because of the extent of the Western sanctions regimes, which are of course now affecting more and more countries. So that's where we are with that particular bizarre scheme. Now, I just want to touch on something else, which is that the other day, the media in the West were full of announcements about how Russia is now in default, that the Russians have defaulted on their latest bond payments, and this is the first Russian default since 1998, and there's even some comparisons with Russia's default at the time of the 1917 revolution. This is fantasy. Now, I have to say, one of the most peculiar things over the last few months has been this Western fixation to try to get some kind of announcement that Russia is in default. This has been pursued obsessively, even beyond the point when this had any real meaning. But if we dial back to February, when the United States and its allies, the Western allies, imposed sanctions against the Russian central bank, they banned their financial institutions from having any contacts with the Russian central bank, and they froze all of the Russian central bank's reserves, which were on their territories. When that happened, there was a whole flurry of briefings given by US officials, including that favorite of mine, the anonymous White House official. And these officials bragged that this would lead to a collapse of the Russian currency, that the ruble would go into free fall, and that Russia would run out of foreign exchange because the Russian central bank would supposedly be pulled in all kinds of different directions. Did it buy rubles using whatever foreign currency it had left from its reserves, which had now become depleted, in order to prevent the ruble collapsing completely? Or did the Russian central bank pay Russia's bondholders, the holders of its sovereign debt? Or if it failed to do the one, the ruble supposedly would crash. That would crash the financial system. That would cause massive repercussions and hyperinflation within Russia. If it failed to do the second, then that would also cause a financial crisis in Russia. Western banks would pull back on their call in Russian banks' financial obligations. The ruble would, the banking system in Russia would collapse, and again we'd have hyperinflation. Problem is, neither scenario actually happened. The ruble didn't collapse. Capital controls, the Russian central bank imposed capital controls, which were assisted by the Western central banks, which also imposed restrictions on trading in the ruble. Very bizarre, but that's what happened. The ruble strengthened instead. It's now currently trading at something like 53 to the dollar. In fact, it touched on 50 to the dollar earlier today. And far from Russia's foreign reserves being depleted, its stock of foreign currency being depleted, it's burgeoned as Russia has been able to continue to sell its oil and gas and its various other products, earning enormous amounts from the sales of these goods, exports, because prices generally have risen. So the result is a massive failure of the February sanctions. But go back to those February sanctions. One of the assumptions behind the February sanctions, the sanctions on the central bank, is that they would eventually result in a Russian default. And of course, we've seen that hasn't happened, because the Russians have all the means necessary. As I said, they're actually full of cash. They're absolutely able and willing, financially speaking, to pay their creditors. They're willing to do it. They're able to do it. They have the money to do it. So the default isn't coming. So what we've seen instead is that since back in February, they said that Russia would default. And since Russia wasn't defaulting, they've now done everything they possibly can to try to engineer a Russian default, but using administrative mechanisms to stop it, to make it happen. So what is happening is that they're blocking payments by the Russians to Russian creditors through the Western banking system. Now, the Russians are offering to make these payments via the Russian banking system. They're offering to Western creditors that they can open accounts in Russian banks, Gazprom Bank in Switzerland, ruble and dollar accounts. The Russians will pay the amount that needs to be paid to honor the debt to into the ruble account at this bank. The bank will then convert the money into dollars, pay it into the corresponding account of the creditor, and the money will then go to the creditor in dollars. The reverse, if you like, of the gas for ruble arrangement. Now, I personally don't see that there's any special problems with this, and I don't really see how that interferes with sanctions. I don't know whether any Western creditor has yet availed itself of this option. But that option, I would have thought, was there. In the meantime, it's important to say that no creditor, no Western creditor has, as of this moment, actually said that Russia is in default. And it's possible that some of them won't do so anyway, whether they decide to adopt this Russian option, this option of opening accounts in Gazprom Bank or not. And I say that because I believe that since it is the US government that is acting to prevent payment of the bonds, I believe that these bondholders now have a potential claim against the US government. Now, I'm not going to try and guess what the prospects of that claim are going to be, but that's how it looks to me. So, a very weird setup altogether, a situation where you have gone through to extraordinary lengths to achieve the appearance of a Russian default. It's questionable whether there has actually been a Russian default. The creditors have not yet said that there has been. And besides, given that Russia has no ability to borrow, no desire to borrow, given that it's up to its ears in cash, what does this even mean? This whole affair, like the oil price cap idea, what it actually shows is that in reality, Western options to hurt Russia economically are now in effect exhausted. Well, that's the economic side. What about the military side? And here is where we get to come back to Sweden and Finland, because along comes Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General. He announces a massive increase, or so it seems, in NATO spending, military spending. He talks about a 300,000 man force that NATO is now going to field against the Russians. And he's talking about an expeditionary force and a core headquarters to be set up in Poland. The force is to number 20,000 men, and there's to be a core headquarters. And there's also supposed to be a strengthening of NATO forces in the Baltic states. The trouble is, when you unpick all of this, it begins to look less impressive than it looks. That figure of 300,000 men, as I've said, is essentially achieved by counting existing soldiers in a different way. The soldiers are there. They were already there before, but they were not committed to NATO's rapid reserve force. Now, in theory at least, they will be committed to NATO's rapid reserve force. Except, of course, will they really be? Will Western governments, European governments, really allow their troops to be used by NATO in some sort of rapid operation? I can actually easily see how expanding this force in that kind of way is going to create more political problems on its deployment, and also in a way dilute its command. If you have 40,000 troops drawn from the United States, France, Britain, perhaps Germany, these are presumably well-trained troops, fairly well organized. They all, as I said, come from existing military units. No new military units are being created as a result of what Stoltenberg is talking about. But you can deploy this force fairly quickly. And of course, the rest of NATO still has its armies. These are NATO troops also, remember, but they're held in reserve. They can be brought into action if and when the case is needed, and on the assumption that NATO governments agree to do so. Well, if you have 300,000 men, you're going to have to go way beyond these countries: United States, France, Germany, Britain. You're going to have to include all sorts of smaller countries as well. And of course, it may be that in a particular crisis, some of these countries may not be so keen to have their troops deployed rapidly by NATO in who knows where and to achieve who knows what. So the whole thing makes, in fact, the NATO military posture look considerably less coherent instead of more coherent. So it may not be quite as impressive as it seems. But what about that deployment of 20,000 men to Poland? Well, that is a big deployment, but of course it's dwarfed by the size of the Russian army. The Russian army in Ukraine, as I said many times, is an expeditionary force drawn from a peacetime army. But it's said to number 200,000 men. The Russians could easily surpass whatever forces NATO deploys in Poland at this time. The same is true, by the way, of the Baltic states. And Medvedev has already talked about Russian responses if NATO does move and starts making deployments in the Baltic, in Sweden, in Finland, in the Baltic states. He's talked about hypersonic weapons and all kinds of other weapons that could be deployed there. And of course, there's also the possibility of nuclear weapons. And we've seen that Russia is now going to supply Iskander missiles to Belarus, which is close to the Baltic. And of course, the Russian President Vladimir Putin pointedly reminded everybody that Iskander missiles are dual use. They can launch nuclear weapons as well as conventional weapons. And that hints as to who will actually be operating these Iskander missiles. They will be operated by the Russians, and before very long, those Iskander missiles will be equipped, will have the option of being equipped, will have the available arsenal to be equipped with nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads. So in practice, this whole Stoltenberg plan not only doesn't change the military balance in the way that it appears to do, but one can easily see how it creates more problems for NATO, certainly in the Baltic region, than it ultimately solves. But it anyway is predicated on higher NATO defence spending. And only yesterday, Prime Minister Boris Johnson of Britain confirmed that Britain will be spending less on defence. It will be increasing defence spending by a lower margin than he promised at the time of the 2019 election. So Britain is actually scaling back on its level of defence spending. And I'm sure more and more countries across Europe are going to do the same, because in a period of deepening economic crisis, why would they want to increase defence spending in the way that Stoltenberg says? I'm going to say something else. I think NATO knows this perfectly well. I think they know perfectly well that all that they're doing, all this talk about 300,000 men armies, advanced forces in the Baltic states, in Poland, it's more theatre than fact. But they now have to at least project the appearance of doing something because of the way they've escalated this crisis to the extent that they have. I'm going to come back to a point that was made by my colleague Alex Christoforou in a joint video we made many months ago, I think before the war even began. And that is that NATO, what the reality is that NATO is staking its entire credibility on Ukraine. An extraordinary act of folly, and one which could have disastrous consequences. If the Russians win the war, which perhaps they will, and if Ukraine falls either formally or de facto under their control, then NATO's credibility is shot to pieces. It will have been exposed as incapable of helping Ukraine and as incapable of doing the Russian economy any significant damage through sanctions. And that is going to cause real surge of concern across Eastern Europe. Now, that is far more important in terms of what's going to happen in the future. than anything that Stoltenberg does. In fact, Stoltenberg's plan is an attempt to reassure East Europeans, nervous East Europeans, that they should stick by NATO despite the disaster that is now looming over the horizon in Ukraine. That's its real purpose. It's not to challenge Russia. It's to try to hold NATO together in the face of the debacle that is now emerging. Now, I'm going to say this. There's, of course, other voices now. There's been an article in Foreign Policy, which is perhaps the single most prestigious foreign affairs journal in the United States. And it too is now talking about the necessity to find a mechanism to achieve peace in Ukraine. And it's saying that it's not realistic for Ukraine to think that it can win this war or reconquer its lost territory from Russia. It has to be realistic. It has to sit down and accept Russian terms, even if that means significant territorial concessions. Well, I come back to what I've said. I said at the beginning that Peskov is now saying Ukraine must accept Russian terms. Its soldiers must lay down their arms. Ukraine must simply accept Russian demands, and that's it. The Russians are not interested in anything more. I think that this is something that the West, in its own self-interests, must now test. And I think that the reality, as I've said many times, is that persisting with this war is a catastrophe for Ukraine. It's destroying the country and it's putting its continued existence in jeopardy. Far better, talk to the Russians, see whether they will accept less. Perhaps they may. Who knows? I mean, there's a massive deficit in trust anymore. And that may mean, if you're the West, that you might have to make concessions as well. One of those concessions might be, for example, doing what the West should have done years ago, which is agree to Russian proposals for negotiations about a new security architecture for Europe, which might ultimately, if not replace NATO, at least relegate NATO and make it less important and less threatening to Russia than it currently is. That might be an offer that the Russians might be interested in and might want to take. But that requires diplomacy. It requires serious diplomatic action. It requires diplomats, ambassadors, foreign ministers, traveling to Moscow, talking to Lavrov and Putin, not lecturing these people about their misdeeds, real and alleged, but instead trying to work out some kind of solution to this conflict which should have never been allowed to happen in the first place. Time is short. It's ticking away. And the tragedy of these last meetings of the G7 in Germany and of NATO in Spain is that they show no glimmer of anything like this happening, and there's no sign of it on the horizon. Well, I hope that changes, because if it doesn't, we have a debacle looming, which, as I've said on previous occasions, will make previous catastrophes like Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the rest seem like minor affairs, punctuation marks in the course of history, whereas a debacle in Ukraine will change its course. Thank you very much for joining me today. Another long video. I'm going to stop now. Remember, you can join us on other platforms, Locals and Rumble, SuperU and ODYSEE and others as well. You can support us also via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can come to our shop and buy things like our magic mugs. And of course, you can also support us by ticking the like button to this video and checking your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.